American comic books have been entertaining and providing a social commentary of the world since 1933. More than 80 years on, what is the state of the industry today? That's what we're talking about on Roundtable with me, David Foster. Often as political as they are entertaining, comics could be said to reflect the state of the world, a comment on war, world leaders, sometimes social change. But is the comic industry managing to stay relevant in fast-moving times? Roundtable's Liam Desborough went to Comic Con in London.
Few other art forms enjoy such a dedicated fan base. Graphic novels inspire an allegiance that provides quite a spectacle. But while outsiders may perceive their stories as light-hearted flights of fancy, the narratives have always had a symbiotic relationship with the politics of the day.
Professor X was Martin Luther King, Magneto was Malcolm X.
Currently there's a story that's just mirroring very much what's going on in America right now.
And with the North American market alone estimated to be worth a little over $1 billion US, their relevance is unlikely to wane. They've been a running commentary on military action since their inception. Captain America was punching Hitler in the face a full year before the United States entered World War II. And Superman was taking out Nazi paratroopers before they even touched the ground. And comic books have had something to say on each of the major conflicts of the 20th century. In 1968, the long campaign for civil rights was raging in the United States. Stan Lee, then editor of Marvel Comics, used his platform to challenge society's failings. He described bigotry and racism as among the deadliest social ills plaguing the world today. A message to his staff and his audience designed to elicit their support in the fight for change.
It's something that comics do very, very well, and they take their reader along with them and allow them to expand and question exactly what it is the establishment is trying to push.
While the industry has been largely applauded for its progressive thinking on some social issues, it has a poor history with others. Batgirl, hampered by a fashion malfunction. Wonder Woman, acting as a secretary to the Justice League. And critics have commented on a lack of diversity among the top-flight superheroes. Creators are racing to address these issues. But these are changes that don't sit well for all fans.
People who are fans of the comics, who've been following it for 10, 20, 30 years, they don't want that change. They go into a shop and all of a sudden they're confused. So I don't think the public always positively react to it.
With superhero franchises providing the lion's share of box office success, their source material is being drawn further into the mainstream. Writers and artists will no doubt move to satisfy their growing readership. But is a willingness to confront social ills behind the longevity of these graphic novels? Or have they been sticking their nose where it doesn't belong?
And with us at the Roundtable today, Paul Gravett, journalist, curator, writer and broadcaster who's worked in comics publishing since 1981. You should see the size of the book that Paul's brought out, too big to bring into the studio. Hannah Berry's also here, illustrator and comics creator. To my left, Emma Saville, senior researcher at Positive Negatives, a non-profit organisation that produces literary comics, and also Why Comic. We'll talk about that in just a moment. Also here, and you can see him scribbling away already. We'll take a look at that at the end of the programme. Richard Johnston, columnist, comic creator, And editor-in-chief of the comic news site Bleeding Cool. Well, having got through all of that, which sounds awfully serious, and we're talking about a subject that by and large isn't, but does have a message. Paul, let me ask you first of all, were comics ever designed simply to be fun?
Well, I suppose early on there are examples of early caricatures and Mickey taking, even Egyptian sort of hieroglyphics and Egyptian scroll and graffiti. So that kind of need to kind of poke fun at authority was there from the beginning. That is one of the elements of comics art that's continued through the centuries. But even when you are being funny, you can often make a point. And we think of, perhaps in Britain, we think of William Hogarth as the great sort of inventor or grandfather of the modern comic strip. And his comics were very clever because he would do stories that could be shocking and amusing and titillating, but also they would make a social and moral point behind them. The Harlot's Progress, the most famous one.
Who wants to sort of comment on this one? Richard, I know you can do both things at once.
Absolutely,
So do join in, and Emma will
try.
come to you on the politics of it in a sense in just a moment. Can comics ever be not fun and simply political, or do they have to be both?
Absolutely, but they'd be terribly boring. I mean, they do exist and incredibly boring comic books, which no one would really want to read. The best way is when you can be entertaining and provocative at the same time. The nice thing about comics for me has always been when people can object to all sorts of ways they're talked about. You can say that someone is a fat person in print and it goes away, but when you draw someone as a fat person, then suddenly that becomes far more effective, far more insulting possibly, and we'll be finding out about that later,
Well,
I'm
remember
sure.
Goofy?
Absolutely, yes.
Yeah.
But again, when you actually make them actually about the people they are meant to be, so like politicians, kings, then suddenly they have more power than just the written word. And so if you have that power, why not use it? Why not exploit
Politics
it?
has always been there, hasn't it, Hannah?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I think it's been. Comics are a very good way of exploring the world around us and of satirizing, I suppose, the world that we live in, because they're very, very accessible, and it's almost insidious in the way that they are so appealing, but they can get across a very serious message at the same time.
Which brings us to Emma, and you want to talk human rights. I mean, we talk human rights and that sort of thing a lot on this programme, but there is an element where there's a crossover, and the work you do has proved to be remarkably successful so far. Tell us about it.
Yeah, so Positive Negatives was founded in 2012 after our director spent 4 years in Sri Lanka working with the UN, and he wanted a way of telling people's stories and the human rights violations that were going on, but in a way that protected people's identity because of the safeguarding.
In a sense, as Richard said, you can draw pictures that tell the story and perhaps identify people, but not quite.
Yeah, exactly. And then I came on board to help find Why Comics, an education charity, to further the impact of our work, so to disseminate it into schools around the world last year. So, and I think I've really been blown away about the power of the comic medium and how it can transcend age, gender, literacy levels. Obviously it's easy to translate into multiple languages.
Give us an idea of how it works.
So all of our work's based on real life stories. So, for example, like last year, I was out in refugee camps in Serbia with Care International. So we'll go into and talk to people about their lives. So we'll spend a day up to a week with one person, like building trust, a connection, getting to know about their family, their journey. And we have a very participatory methodology. So it's very important to us that it's their story and not our interpretation of it.
And then what somebody portrays it in strip cartoon form to sort of get across some kind of message.
Yeah, so myself and the other researchers on the team, we write the scripts and the storyboards, and then we try and find artists who are the right gender and ideally cultural and ethnic background as the respondents.
That sounds to me like it's a fabulous idea. I mean, what did you say, 30,000 schools in 32 different countries at the same time. But are there examples of where it's been used for political purposes that are not necessarily quite as clean as this, but more nefarious?
I mean, certainly in the book I've just done, Mangasia, looking at Asian comics, we're exhibiting in the touring exhibition at the moment examples of some rather alarming nationalistic comics, where, as you may know, there's obviously a complex history and relationship between Japan and Korea through the 20th century, and there is a sector that has used these comics to create essentially sort of hate-mongering, xenophobic comics attacking the other country, and they attack each other. And so I would say that there's no doubt that the power of comics is also a dangerous power. Obviously, it can be used to propagandize not the most positive things, as Emma's organisation is doing.
You talk about things like Tintin, I think, is quite classic, seen as like being kind of French colonial, and things like Tintin in the Congo can't be printed in its current
It
form.
caused a big scandal in the UK because of its
Yeah.
portrayals of African people.
Absolutely.
Exactly.
But
Yeah,
if you look at things like Asterix, I mean, again, it's the way that it's very kind of like separatist for the French kind of people. It's like we are the best. Everybody else, we are holed up against. It's almost got a bit kind of like Catalonian or Brexit kind of feel about it these days.
We'll come back to you in just a moment, Emma. But which ones stand out from the historical point of view?
Well, I would say that the big scandal in America during the 50s was about EC Comics. They were famous for their horror and their crime comics. This was during a period when, of course, under the kind of Cold War, the anti-communist atmosphere was prevalent in America. And one psychiatrist was able to persuade Senator Kefauver to hold live TV hearings where they put the artists and publishers on trial, essentially, investigating the effects of comic books on juveniles and blaming comic books for juvenile delinquency.
And they were banned, weren't they, for a while?
They were. Well, in fact, in America, they had a very strict self-regulation policy, which only just disappeared in the 21st century. Over here, it led to debates in the UK, in the Houses of Parliament, an actual act of Parliament called the Children and Young Persons Harmful Publications Act. And for many people, that stigma, that branding of them being harmful is definitely still in people's minds.
To butt in, I was going to ask Emma here, in the field in which you're working, which is very sensitive, isn't it? We're talking about human rights, we're talking about abused children, we're talking about traumatized people. Do you find there's a difficulty sometimes in making sure you get the right line on these sort of things?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, all of our resources are based on real life stories. So, some people will ask, like, why isn't there a happy ending? Or, and we're telling people's journeys. Sometimes there are, but that's just life. So, I mean, certainly a large part of our portfolio has always been deemed suitable for age 14 plus because of the safeguarding issues, because we're looking at really complex topics such as human trafficking, sexual violence, for example. But I think, the beauty of the comic medium is that you can talk about these really grave issues without having to be pornographic or shocking, is that, you can show, for example, a woman being led into a room and then your imagination does the rest, so you don't actually have to be overtly explicit. And the whole point of our work is to get people to engage with the issues in a critical way and build
follow
empathy.
up afterwards as well, to some extent. Are you part of that? Does your comic book culture lead, as far as you're aware, to more constructive ways of life?
So, I mean, there's been examples of like our work intersecting kind of government and policy making in the third sector. So we did a comic called A BK Story that was commissioned by The Guardian, and that was actually submitted as part of the Modern Slavery Act in 2015 to Parliament. So on top of all the kind of dry policy bump, our comic was on top. So again, to humanise the statistics and to tell the human story of what it's actually like to be.
Who wants to pick a particular character out of comic book culture and say and surprise us all with what this person actually represented?
Well, I think the one that always sticks out to me, certainly right now, is Marvel's character, the Punisher, which is seen as, originally started in the Spider-Man comics as a kind of a vigilante anti-hero who would basically shoot the bad guys rather than beat them up and wrap them up for the police. And that kind of character has been picked up by all sorts of strange elements within society. It's been picked up by the military, it became a sniper hero for some time, and recently you had a guy who dressed up as the Punisher, went to a comic convention in Phoenix with the intent to kill someone, to murder someone, an actor who was there, and then try and kill as many police as he could.
And then we saw what happened.
Well, he was stopped. One of his friends who was speaking to him on Facebook realised what was happening.
But life, we saw what happened in Las Vegas.
Yeah, absolutely, that kind of thing. So those kind of images have certain power, and sometimes I don't think people quite realise just how powerful they can be. And
the Punch is also interesting because wasn't he a Vietnam vet? So there is actually a human element that explains his psychotic behaviour.
Oh, absolutely. It was written very carefully by people who knew what they were doing, the psychological aspects, but you never know what's going to get picked up.
No.
There is still an anti-hero, there's still a nasty person in some of these comic books called Nixon, isn't there, who is an American president, is that right?
Well, he was a villain, or at least a disguised villain in the Captain America arc, wasn't it, in the 70s?
Secret Empire.
Secret Empire.
And of course he stayed as president in the Watchmen comic books, and that was one of the ideas, that he's a president who stayed beyond his time, the idea of like power extending beyond where it should go. So you had him still being president in the 1980s.
And this was an interesting period, of course. It was post-Watergate. It definitely was commenting on this. And Captain America, normally dressed up in his stars and stripes, abandoned his costume, stopped wearing the flag, and became nomad, a superhero without a country.
Emma really wanted to talk simply about the work she's doing with human rights, but I'm going to talk to you also as a human being and as somebody who presumably, like me, looked at comics at some particular point. Did you get a message from them, or did you just, like me when I was younger, just think they were great fun?
Yeah, I mean, so I read comics as a teenager. So, you know, I was also a big fan of Calvin Hobbes and things like that. So,
Which is one of your favourites.
Absolute favourite, yeah.
and as an adult, I've certainly read more kind of political graphic novels like Mouse by Alt Spiegelman and Palestine by Joe Sacco and things like that.
Well, okay, tell our audience what they are and what they gave you.
Okay, so Mouse is a graphic novel about the Holocaust, and it's the story of Art Spiegelman interviewing his father about his experiences of, you know, surviving a concentration camp and what that was like. And it was certainly, I think, well, Paul can speak more on this, but the kind of flagship kind of graphic novel that suddenly told people that comics...
It won a Pulitzer Prize, didn't it? That was a landmark for a start. Yeah, it became an absolutely crucial way of understanding the Holocaust.
Yeah. And I think it certainly transcended the medium in that suddenly comics weren't just for comic book geeks, but they were also for the educated public and a very powerful communications tool. That
I think even more important also was the way that, of course, it's called Mouse because all the Jews are portrayed as mice, all the Nazis are portrayed as cats. So it took the Tom and Jerry kind of funny animal cartoon trope of comics and animation and gave them an extra meaning, a very powerful meaning.
When I was young, every Thursday the Eagle used to land, I suppose you could say. My brothers normally got it before me because they were older and stronger. But when I got to read it, it was Dan Dare. I wanted to see. It was Digby and Dan Dare. It was the Mekon. Are you telling me that was about world domination by the Americans, or was it just a
When
damn
Dan
good
Dare
story?
began, it was in 1950, of course, is when Eagle began. I mean, we were still, in Britain, we were still going through rationing, and it's no accident that the first storyline involved Dan Dare and his crew in the Interplanetary Space Patrol going out and finding food to bring back to Earth. That was their mission. And there was basically in the same way at that time the empire hadn't quite set, so the whole world was more or less, or much of it was pink. The idea is that we would then in the future, Britain would be going out and make the rest of the galaxy pink as well, and it would all be British. It was definitely Britain as the champions of the space.
It was yonder, as Digby always used to say.
It was yonder, exactly.
Yeah.
and you had the class thing, because obviously Dan was the more upper class sort of, shall we say, middle, whereas Digby was the working class representative. And it did have, of course, political aspects to it, even though perhaps you weren't picking up on that quite at the time.
No, I certainly wasn't.
No.
Until I started thinking about this programme, I wasn't even aware that was the case now. Are we seeing more, because most of these characters were establishment, if not right-wing, they were certainly sort of part of the good guys as
the status quo,
propagated
really,
by those governments. Are we seeing more left-leaning characters now in reaction?
Oh no, it's. I think we need to distinguish between it feels like there's a very, very big divide in terms of content, in terms of I suppose the creator-owned content, the individual graphic novels and the small press and zines, and then the bigger publishers, the more...
With the big properties and
big
franchises.
properties, yeah, the constructive comics, so Marvel and DC, yeah. I mean, I can't really speak to Marvel and DC, but I think certainly in the... I hesitate to call it independent, because I'm technically part of that, and my graphic novels was brought out from
And we should say that you're not working for the New Statesman anymore. You've gone on to better.
I don't think it was anything personal, but if anybody needs a weekly cartoon, I'm available.
Livestock is one you do, isn't it?
Yes, yeah. Well, I mean that was.
Pick that up somewhere.
Yeah. So that was a graphic novel which was technically it belongs to that kind of creator-owned area, and I feel like that area is becoming more and more. Well, not more and more, but it's very staunchly anti-establishment, I feel, in terms of the content created, because it is individuals, and there's no they're not being constructed to reach large audiences. There's not huge amounts of money behind it, so there's not marketing wings, and they're not being put together to sell reams and reams.
As two women representing your gender at this table, do you feel there's always been a lack of female role models in comic books?
I mean, I can't really speak to the Marvel DC side of things. I know that I wrote a comic strip for the 2000 AD Free Comic Book Day special edition last year, and it was drawn by a woman. I think that we were the first all-female team that ever worked on 2000 AD, and that's been
since 1977. So 40 years.
There's a.
I don't want to rush these things.
No, we can't. Look, we can't hurry these things. Naturally, they
They do argue that actually it's not they have a policy that they don't want women actually creating for them for the Science Fiction Weekly, but that they don't get very many women applying. But there is a knock-on effect.
There you go.
There's no examples.
That might be another place to go.
Yeah, well, maybe.
But did you feel this? That there were women superheroes, that your gender was represented properly, or perhaps not reflecting the way that society's gradually changed? As a reader?
As a reader, I mean, yeah, I think I would agree with the previous comments that there has been more of a slant both in the actual comic book artists and then the characters that are portrayed as well. And certainly there have been lots of stereotypical female characters portrayed across the board. So there does seem to be a slight
It's interesting
shift.
with that hand gesture as well.
I think there was also a big change in the way the audience has changed, because it's not that long ago when boys and girls read comic books equally, and back into the 40s and the 50s and the 60s. And then as things moved, you got more kind of concentration in the things that sell most, and they became like more action, adventure, and superhero, and other things went away. And especially things like the horror lines were always very popular amongst female readers in Britain in the 70s.
Like
Comic books,
Misty,
except
for
comics like
example.
Misty.
Yeah.
And they're kind of getting a bit of a comeback now. You're seeing things like the Twilight films actually finding those kind of audiences, and they're kind of coming back into comic books. So you're seeing a bit of a change.
That one of the main reasons why more women and more girls are reading comics is of course because of manga, Japanese comics. They filled a gap when the British girls' comics industry pretty much died, and when most of the other mainstreams weren't producing stuff aimed at girls. And their stories, they have the biggest industry in the world and the biggest representation of women authors.
I'm going to ask Emma in just a moment. Excuse me, Hannah. I'm just going to ask you where you want to take what you're doing in the future. But is it true, talking about minorities and underrepresented groups, that Marvel has only just now recently hired its first black cartoonist?
No, that's been going back for
certainly,
decades.
it's only just been its first black woman writer.
That's true. Yes,
And this was on Black Panther, wasn't it?
Right.
Is that right, I think?
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
And she was a successful novelist, so she was
Yes,
picked up for those reasons.
she's crossed over from another medium, yeah. But there is obviously a lack of diversity in the mainstream and even in the independent world too. It needs to be addressed and needs to be encouraged. I think that is happening though, and we're certainly seeing there's many more women creators currently, and there are also women publishers who can, of course, have a bigger impact as well.
Are you seeing a notice being taken by other humanitarian groups and just interested parties to take the successful work you've done with Positive and Negatives and with Y Comics to take it further? Is there an appetite for that?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, so a recent example was we did a comic on crack cocaine addiction in Guinea-Bissau as part of the BBC Focus on Africa series. And that was seen by over 92 million people in a single week, which again, I think speaks to the power of the medium and how it can reach new audiences. And like the example I gave earlier with the BK intersecting the Modern Slavery Act of 2015, our work was mentioned in a debate in the House of Lords last year. So again, that our work is a way of taking these complex issues to new audiences, so be it the media, the general public, school children, government and policymakers as a medium of building empathy and understanding and promoting positive social change.
Richard, you may have to finish some of these in just a moment, but for the benefits of the programme, hand them round to those whom you have represented.
Okay, I'll have a little bit of a doodling.
And we will talk about, where do you think the future of cartoons lies?
I mean, I
Okay, it is a cartoon. I'm not sure I'm going to show that one, but thank you very much. It gives the illusion of jowls.
The illusion, absolutely.
The illusion.
Well, this is, most people like to say that their caricatures look like a brother or an elderly uncle or an aunt to them. That's the usual reaction I get, and that's when I know I've got it bang on.
Okay, we'll leave those where they are, and we will take some pictures in just a moment. But what do you think the future is?
I mean, in the going back to in the more independent side of comics, I do feel like women are very well represented. And when you go to comic festivals and comic fairs, you can see that there are it's 50-50 men and women creators, and when there's things like small press and zines, there are more. It's more the creators are more diverse, but that sort of tapers away when you get to more published graphic novels. And I feel like this is an issue that we need to address. We need to have more stories.
Yeah. What about what somebody once described as the post-satirical, post-truth culture we have at the moment? It's like fertilizer for your industry, isn't it?
It's almost hard to satirise now.
It's beyond satire. It's post-satire, perhaps, actually.
I think it's still a hell of a lot of fun to try, though.
Yes, they'll have a go. They still deserve it, don't they? Absolutely. And they're still very sensitive to it. We can still
that's the
their
thing.
pomposity. Yeah.
President Donald Trump is incredibly sensitive to criticism.
Yes.
And any kind of satire. I mean, things like Saturday Night Live, he was incensed by. So, yeah, I think there's definite imperative for us all to at least try.
There's a whole wave of Trump satirical graphic novels coming out.
There are.
Is that true? They're
Oh, yeah. They already have been published.
Do they they have to be given away, or do people buy them?
Oh, no, they buy them. I mean,
Absolutely.
there's Rick Sikoriak doing these pastiches of Marvel comic characters like the Incredible Hulk becomes the unquotable Trump.
The
example,
superhero comic books, The Savage Dragon, has just had President Trump expel all aliens from America, literal aliens from another planet. So they've all had to go to Canada. So yeah, these happening in all the storylines. They love it. And Marvel has just had their character Captain America basically become a Nazi and take over all of America to show the kind of the insidious nature of how fascism can come in by the back door, not always wearing a swastika. So, and that you look at the American politics at the time, and it seems very of the moment.
Emma, good luck with the work you're doing. Do you know, we've had it's just rushed through this conversation. The programme's pretty much come to an end. We've turned the final page, but certainly not in terms of what you guys are going to produce in the future. Thank you so much. It is a fascinating industry, and there's so much to it. But we have to disappear. Heavens to Murgatroyd. That's not really a cartoon, is it? That was Top Cat, I think, but to some extent it was. The truth is out there. That's another film, but there we go. It's out there yonder, as Digby used to say. From me, David Foster, and the Roundtable team, I hope you've enjoyed our conversation today. See you next time.